In this study, we've arrived at Revelation chapter 20, and we're going to discuss the millennial reign of Christ in some detail. There's a 1,000-year period here where Christ reigns with his saints, and this has been interpreted in many different ways. However, before we look at it in detail, I want to make this video and just show you the 4 basic views on the millennial reign of Christ. The first view that we will examine is called Postmillennialism. And Postmillennialism isn't very popular anymore, but it used to be very popular. And so this is how the view works. Jesus comes the first time, dies, resurrects, establishes his church, and then you have the church age. Well, the millennium is sort of a special era that takes place toward the end of the church age. It's sort of the golden age within the church age. You have a long church age, but toward the end, you come into this period where Christianity begins to triumph. The gospel spreads everywhere. Light, truth, and justice cover the whole world. It's a very optimistic perspective. Things just get better and better. And as Christianity triumphs and the world improves, it finally gets so good that Jesus comes back and begins to reign over this utopia that he has created. He comes back, you have the last judgment, eternity begins. And so, this view does not suggest that there's going to be some tribulation or apocalypse right before the second coming. Much to the contrary, things are going to be very positive, eliciting Christ to return. Now, you may think this is the strangest view on the second coming of Jesus Christ you ever heard, but it makes a lot more sense after you consider the cultural and contextual milieu in which this was born. After the Enlightenment came, you had a period in the 17 and 1800s that was characterized by optimism. The notion was that science and reason and democracy had ushered in a golden age, and things were going to get better and better for people. It was a very positive perspective. Now, this began to shatter in the 1900s with the First World War and the Second World War. This optimism that is sometimes known as modernism, that the modern age has arrived. Now things are just going to get better and better because we're finally an enlightened species. This idea begins to collapse in the 20th century when you have the First World War and you have so many deaths and you have people dying of nerve gas agents, and then you have World War II, tremendous loss of life, unprecedented. You have the Holocaust, you have the atomic bomb used in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and humanity had to wake up to the fact that the science and the reason and the democracy that they thought were going to save the world is not going to save the world. The science, which had been waved around as though it were a magic wand that was going to fix anything, that it had to be acknowledged that, science, for all of its blessings, has given humankind the ability to destroy ourselves and to destroy the planet. As Albert Einstein said, I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. He was one of the drivers taking us into this age of confidence in science as though it were a solution to every problem, but then he saw what nuclear energy could do in Japan. And so this sort of Western optimism began to fail at the time of the 2 world wars, and Western civilization has been more negative ever since, and not nearly naive, or at least not so naive, as to the ability of reason, science, and progress to fix everything. It used to be supposed that if we just got rid of all religions, and sometimes people still talk like this, that we could fix the world, we could live in peace. But in World War II, those who killed the most people were anti-religious. And so this myth has been unraveling ever since. Well, postmillennialism was kind of leeching on the culture. Christians believed that we'd come into a period of optimism and that we would be able to carry the gospel around the world because we had better modes of transportation and better modes of communication. And this is known as dominion theology, that things are going to get better and better. The gospel will prevail. The nations will be converted. And after Christianity triumphs over the whole world, Christ will come back to receive it. Well, this view, postmillennialism, largely disappeared after the two world wars because it was just leeching on the optimism of the culture. When Western civilization became more negative, this very positive view went away. And it's interesting because you look at Paul, you look at Jesus, you look in the book of Revelation, etc. There seems to be, this uniform opinion that things are going to get worse before they get better. Things are going to get really bad right before Jesus returns. And how this view ever survived biblical scrutiny is beyond me. But nevertheless, it was very popular. It's largely gone now, so this is not one of the perspectives that we are going to examine in detail. I want to talk briefly about the dispensational version of premillennialism. Now, this is the dominant idea in evangelical Protestantism, where Christ comes, dies, resurrects, establishes his church. Then you have the church age here. And then you have the rapture. Christ comes and people are essentially zapped off the planet. You can see this in the Left Behind movie or in the Left Behind novels where people just vanish off of airplanes, etc. And the church is just gone. Well, then this leads to a period of tribulation. They usually understand this to be 7 years. Sometimes they understand it to be 3.5 years. But nevertheless, this leads to a period of tribulation where the church is gone, but the Antichrist rises to power and makes war against the Jewish people and against the nation of Israel. And you have 144,000 Jews leading the Jews to Christ and leading the fight against the Antichrist, etc. And at the end of the 7 years, Jesus comes again. He already came to get his church. Now he comes back to establish a kingdom on earth. He comes back, he deals with the Antichrist, he deals with the false prophet, he locks the devil away, and then you have him establish a millennium on earth. Some will tell you that the millennium is a literal 1,000 years. Others will tell you that 1,000 years is just a way of saying a very long time. Either way, in this view, Christ comes and he establishes a kingdom based in Israel, in Jerusalem. And this is where the promises made to the Jewish people throughout the scripture in relationship to having dominion, having a kingdom of righteousness in Zion, Jerusalem being the world capital, etc. All these things are fulfilled here. And a lot of these folks, especially the old school dispensationalists, some of the more modern progressives don't hold to this, but they expect that the temple prophesied by Ezekiel in chapters 40 through 48 will literally be reconstructed, and that Jesus as Messiah will oversee the temple. And there will be animal sacrifices, there will be a Levitical priesthood, etc. And Christ and his saints will reign over this dispensation, over this millennial kingdom, and the whole world will observe the Old Testament law, and they will come to the temple and offer sacrifices. And then at the end of this, Satan is released from his prison, and then you have the last battle, the final judgment, and then the new creation, the new earth begin. Eternity begins here. So what to say about this? Well, as if you've been following along in the book of Revelation with me so far, you know that I'm no fan of the idea of a pre-tribulation rapture, that Jesus will come back, get his church, and then he'll come back at a later point and establish his kingdom. This view suffers tremendously. Now, in Revelation, we've seen back in chapter 3 and verse 10, and also at the beginning of chapter 4. If you didn't see those videos, I encourage you to go see them. The evidence that dispensationalists use to prove the rapture in the book of Revelation is sparse. Now, they don't usually use Revelation so much. Most of their arguments come from Paul, come from the Olivet Discourse and the Gospels, and come from John chapter 14. And each one of those could be discussed, and I have discussed those previously, and maybe I'll make a video sometime in the future to discuss why the rapture is such a bad idea and why all the arguments for it fail on biblical grounds. But nevertheless, this view, as we've seen throughout Revelation, does not work. The tribulation period in Revelation is a time for the suffering of the church. Now, if the church is suffering persecution the way that Christ suffered persecution, then how can the church be gone? How can it have left in the rapture? Right? There's so much about this view that just does not make sense. And as for this idea that Jesus is going to come back and build a temple and we're going to have animal sacrifices all over again, if you think that, you need to go read the book of Hebrews about 20 times. Right? Read chapter 10 and verse 18, where it says that Christ brought us forgiveness, and where there is forgiveness, there is no longer any need for the offerings of sin. Within the context of the Levitical priesthood, where, read chapter 7, where the Levitical priesthood has been replaced by the Melchizedek priesthood of Christ. Read chapter 7 and verse 12, where the laws pertaining to temple and sacrifice are now changed due to the arrival of Jesus. I mean, this notion that we're going to have a temple is, again, and we're going to sacrifice animals, and this is acceptable to Christ, is ridiculous. I mean, you just need to read the New Testament again if you think this is going to actually take place. We're going to go through Revelation 20 2 times, and we're going to do it once from an all-millennial perspective and once from a post-tribulational premillennial perspective, which I'm just going to call premillennialism, because usually that's what this is called. This is not the same type of premillennialism as the rapture folks, but it is a type of premillennialism. And when we say premillennialism, we mean the 1,000 years is future. That's why it's pre, because we are before the millennium. The millennium is going to come later on. And so in this view that we will look at length, Christ comes, establishes his church. Then you have the church age. And there's some sort of tribulation for true believers throughout the entirety of the church age. But toward the church age, you get a tribulation period. The church does not leave in the rapture before this arrives. The church is here. They are suffering through the tribulation because, as we've seen throughout the book of Revelation, the church is left vulnerable to the violence of its enemies. We suffer and die with Christ, common New Testament idea. And after the church goes through this period of tribulation, Christ returns for the second coming. Then he establishes a millennium. Now, this view will not necessarily say that the kingdom of Israel and Jerusalem, will preside over the entire world, and that there will be a temple built in Jerusalem. All right, this view does not accept that. All this view says is that there is this millennium, which does not need to be literally 1,000 years. 1,000 years in Revelation is just a way of saying a very long time. That there will be a kingdom, and we will reign with Christ over it, and we don't know what it looks like. We accept that we don't really know what it looks like, just like eternity. We don't really know what eternity is going to look like. Well, the millennium is the same way. We just don't know what it will look like. And so Christ and his saints, we'll talk later as to whether all saints participate in the millennium or if it's just the martyrs of Christ. That's one of the big disputes in this chapter. They will reign for the period of the millennium. At the end of that, Satan is loosed from his prison. He launches another rebellion, and then you have the last judgment, and then eternity begins. We will discuss this view at length. This view was popular with the church fathers. It disappeared in the Middle Ages, and sometime well after the Protestant Reformation, various forms of premillennialism became popular in the Protestant world. Now, the other view that we will look at in detail, and we're going to look at this one first, is the notion that Christ comes, establishes his church, and then the millennium is the entire church age. That the 1,000 years is a figurative way of saying the length of the church age. And so Christ and his church reign. Now, there is a dispute as to whether or not we're considered to be reigning here on earth, or you reign with Christ after you die. Christ is seated at the right hand of the Father. When you die, you go to heaven. You reign with him. according to certain views of Amillennialism. We will talk about that. Then at the beginning of the millennium, there's some sort of apostasy, some sort of tribulation. They don't necessarily think it has to be 7 years, but there's something takes place that is really bad. Things get worse before they get better. And then Christ comes, the second coming and the final judgment. When Christ comes, eternity begins. Right? New heavens and new earth. This view, Amillennialism, has been around for a long time. It became essentially the official view of the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and there are many Protestants today who believe this view. When I say it's the official view of Catholicism, don't misunderstand me as saying that this is a Catholic view and therefore not a Protestant view. There are many Protestants who hold this view. I took a Revelation course at a university with a Baptist professor. He was an all-millennialist. Most Baptists are premillennialists, but sometimes they are all-millennialists. And so we will look at both of these views at length. First, we will go through Revelation chapter 20, verse by verse, giving an all-millennial interpretation. Then after that, we will go through it again, verse by verse, with a premillennial interpretation. I don't really care which one of these views is right. I'm not totally persuaded by either one. My goal is to be even-handed and to show you the strengths and weaknesses of both. And I will attack both views whenever they're weak, because both of them have a lot of weaknesses. There's no clear winner in this race. And both of them have strengths, and I will try to make sure you understand those as well. So these are the 4 basic views, and these are the 2 that we are going to look at in detail. Amillennialism will be the next video, and then premillennialism will be the video after that. I hope you'll join me.